Hello, my little night owls. Tonight we begin with something shadier. A girl who became a princess at 14, watched her husband being butchered on a battlefield, became a queen, buried her only son, and died at 28, possibly poisoned by her own husband. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1470, a 14-year-old girl stood in a French cathedral and married a prince she barely knew. Her father had arranged it, a political alliance meant to overthrow a king. She wore silk and jewels and smiled for the assembled nobles, and within a year, that prince would be dead, stabbed repeatedly. His body displayed like a trophy in a church while his mother screamed. Her name was Anne Neville, and her entire life was a transaction. She didn't choose her first husband, didn't choose her second husband, didn't choose to become queen. Every decision was made for her by men who saw her as a useful piece on a political chessboard. Her father, her father-in-law, her eventual second husband. They all had plans for Anne, and none of those plans involved asking what she wanted. By the time she died at 28, she'd been married twice, widowed once, crowned queen, and had buried her only child. She'd watched her father die in battle, watched her sister's husband executed, watched her world collapse and rebuild and collapse again. And through it all, Anne had no control, no voice, no choice. But here's what they don't tell you in history books. Anne knew exactly what was happening. She wasn't naive, wasn't blind. She watched her father use her sister as a political tool, watched Isabel married off to a weak prince. And Anne knew her turn was coming. She just didn't know how much worse it would be. Anne Neville was born on June 11th, 1456 at Warwick Castle, the massive stone fortress in the heart of England. Not some crumbling medieval ruin. This was power made visible. Walls 20 feet thick, towers that could be seen for miles, a castle that screamed, "We own this land." Her father was Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, the most powerful man in England who wasn't wearing a crown. And he made sure everyone knew it. Imagine being a child in that household. Servants everywhere. Over 500 people living in the castle at any given time. Cooks, stable hands, knights, ladies in waiting, tutors, musicians. Warwick didn't just have wealth. He had his own court, his own army, his own foreign policy. Anne's earliest memories would have been stone. Cold stone floors under her feet. Stone walls that made every sound echo. Stone staircases she climbed holding her nurse's hand. The castle was beautiful in its way. Tapestries covering the walls to keep out drafts, rushes on the floor mixed with herbs to mask the smell of dogs and people and medieval life. But it was also cold, always cold. Even in summer, those stone walls held the chill. She shared a nursery with her sister Isabel, 2 years older, the only other child who understood what it meant to be Warwick's daughter, to be watched constantly, evaluated, judged not on who you were, but on what you could become, what alliance you could seal, what bloodline you could join. Their mother, Anne Beauchamp, Countess of Warwick in her own right, managed the household. She was an heiress, had brought massive estates to her marriage with Warwick, was wealthy enough to have been a prize herself. But in that household, she was background. She supervised the still room where medicines were made sure the accounts were kept, entertained noble guests, smiled when required, and she taught her daughters to do the same. Anne learned early how to be invisible, how to sit quietly during her father's meetings with other nobles, how to keep her face blank when men talked about her future like she wasn't in the room, how to curtsy, how to speak French and Latin and English with perfect pronunciation, how to never, ever ask questions. Her education was thorough, brutal even. She had tutors from dawn until dinner, Latin grammar, French conversation, music. She learned to play the lute and sing. Dancing, every noble dance from France to Italy. Embroidery, religious instruction, everything a valuable marriage prospect needed. But here's what's twisted. She was also taught to read and write. Unusual for girls of her time. Warwick wanted educated daughters, not because he valued women's intellect, because educated daughters could write letters, could manage estates, could be useful to their future husbands in ways that went beyond childbearing. Anne read, voraciously, romances, religious texts, whatever she could get her hands on. And in those books, she found women who made choices, who had adventures, who controlled their own destinies. She was smart enough to know those were fantasies. By the time Anne was 10, she'd watched her father orchestrate the Wars of the Roses like a puppeteer, watched him put Edward IV on the throne, watched him parade through London with armies at his back, watched powerful men bow to him, and she'd watched her sister Isabel become terrified. Because Isabel was the elder. Isabel would be married first, and both girls knew what that meant. Isabel would be traded, sent to whatever man served their father's ambitions best, and Anne would follow. The girls were close in the way siblings become close when they're isolated, when they're the only two people in their world who truly understand. They shared a bedchamber long after they could have had separate rooms, whispered to each other in the dark, made up stories about running, away, about becoming nuns, about anything other than the future they could see approaching. Isabel was prettier, everyone said so. Blonde hair that caught the light, a softer face. Anne was darker, sharper features, more serious. People called Isabel charming, called Anne clever, and in medieval noble society, charming was worth more than clever. But Anne had something Isabel didn't. She had the ability to detach, to watch what was happening to her, like it was happening to someone else. Isabel felt everything, cried when their father shouted, panicked when marriage negotiations were mentioned. Anne learned to go still inside, to become stone like the castle walls. She'd need that skill. When Anne was 12, she attended a feast at Warwick Castle, one of her father's massive political gatherings. 300 guests, musicians in the gallery, jugglers between courses, whole roasted swans presented on silver platters, wine flowing like water. Anne sat at the high table, in a new dress of blue velvet, her hair braided and coiled, playing the role of noble daughter, smiling at guests, speaking French to a visiting diplomat, being decorative and useful and utterly empty inside. And she watched her father work the room, watched him whisper to this lord, laugh with that bishop, draw men aside for private conversations, watched him build alliances with wine and promises and the careful distribution of favour. That's when she understood, really understood. She wasn't a person to these men. She was currency, a coin her father could spend when the price was right. Isabel figured it out the same night. The girls met later in their chamber. Isabel was crying. Anne just sat on the bed, staring at nothing. "We're going to be sold," Isabel whispered. Anne didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. Isabel already knew. The castles, the education, the fine dresses, the music lessons, all of it was just making them more valuable, more expensive, more worth trading. And the worst part, there was nothing they could do, nowhere to run, no one to appeal to. Their mother wouldn't help. She'd been sold the same way. The church wouldn't help. They blessed these marriages. The law wouldn't help. It belonged to men like their father. So the girls did what women had done for centuries. They waited, they learned, they prepared, and they prayed their future husbands would at least be kind. Anne's prayers wouldn't be answered. By 1469, when Anne was 13, the situation had shifted. Her father's relationship with King Edward IV had collapsed. Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville in secret, a widow, a Lancastrian family. No foreign alliance, no political value, just a woman the king wanted. Warwick was humiliated, publicly, internationally. He'd been in France negotiating Edward's marriage to a French princess, promising diplomats, making arrangements. And then Edward announced he was already married. Had been for months. Anne watched her. Father's rage, watched him pace the great hall, watched him throw things, smash cups against walls, shout about betrayal and ingratitude and insolence, and she watched him start planning. Isabel was married to George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's brother, in July 1469, without the king's permission, an act of open defiance. The wedding took place in Calais because getting married in England without royal approval would have been too dangerous. Anne helped her sister pack, helped her dress for the journey, watched Isabel's hands shake as she tried to eat breakfast the morning they left. "What if he's cruel?" Isabel whispered while they were alone. Anne had no answer. Clarence was vain, weak, easily manipulated, but cruel. They didn't know, couldn't know. Isabel would find out after it was too late to matter. Anne kissed her sister goodbye, watched her ride away in a procession of guards and servants and baggage carts, watched the only person who truly understood her disappear down the road. And Anne was alone. The rebellion happened fast. Warwick raised an army, captured Edward IV briefly, tried to force him to break with the Woodvilles. It failed. Edward regained control, and in March 1470, Warwick fled to France, with Clarence, with Isabel, who was heavily pregnant, and with Anne, who had no choice but to follow. The crossing was hell, spring storms in the channel, the ship rolling and pitching, Isabel in labour, screaming, bleeding, servants trying to help, while waves crashed over the deck. They couldn't land. French ports refused them entry. Isabel gave birth at sea, to a baby that lived for hours. Maybe a day. Sources disagree. Anne held her sister, while Isabel sobbed, while the tiny body, a girl they said, was wrapped in cloth and committed to the sea, while their mother prayed, while the ship kept moving because they had nowhere to go. That's what power looks like when it failed. That's what happened when you were on the losing side. Isabel's baby died because they were refugees, because they couldn't land, because no one would help them. Anne was 13 years old. She just watched her sister give birth on a storm-tossed ship, watched a baby die, watched it thrown into the sea, and she knew her turn was coming, knew her father would need to trade her next. They finally landed in France. Louis XI, the French king, welcomed them, not out of kindness, out of opportunity. Warwick was useful. Warwick had armies and experience and a grudge. Louis wanted England destabilised, wanted Burgundy, England's ally, weakened, wanted chaos, and he had a plan. Louis XI was known as the Spider King, quiet, patient, weaving webs of alliances and betrayals. He looked at the Neville family, broken, desperate, living on his charity, and saw opportunity. He would reconcile Warwick with Margaret of Anjou. Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian queen in exile, the woman who'd fought Warwick for a decade, whose armies Warwick had destroyed, whose husband, Henry VI, Warwick had helped imprison, who had every reason to hate Warwick with everything she had. Louis arranged a meeting at Angers, in his presence, where both parties would be forced to be civil. Anne was there, standing behind her father, watching. Margaret of Anjou entered the room like a storm. She was in her 40s by then, still beautiful, still terrifying. She'd led armies, ordered executions, spent years fighting for her husband's throne, while Henry VI descended into madness, and she looked at Warwick with absolute hatred. The negotiations took days. Louis mediated, cajoled, promised, threatened. Slowly, painfully, a deal emerged. Warwick would help restore Henry VI to the throne. Margaret would accept Warwick's support. Together, they'd overthrow Edward IV, but Margaret wanted insurance, wanted to make sure Warwick couldn't betray her again, couldn't switch sides when it became convenient. She wanted a marriage between her son, Edward of Westminster, and Warwick's youngest daughter. Anne. Anne heard her name, heard Margaret say it, heard her father agree, heard the terms being negotiated. Dowry, titles, lands, her future being arranged by people who'd been killing each other last year. And Anne said nothing. Because what could she say? No? Refuse? Run? There was nowhere to run. Edward of Westminster was 15. Anne had never met him, never seen him except maybe as a child before the wars really started. He'd been raised in exile in France by his mother, Margaret of Anjou, who'd filled his head with hatred of Yorkists, who'd trained him to fight, to kill, to reclaim his father's throne through blood. He reportedly had a cruel streak, enjoyed violence. Some accounts say he liked to watch executions, to see men die, that Margaret had encouraged this, had told him a king needed to be feared. Anne was going to marry him. The betrothal was announced, gifts exchanged, documents signed. Anne stood in formal robes, while men she'd never met discussed her wedding night, discussed when she'd be bedded, discussed the expected heirs. Margaret looked at Anne like she was livestock, useful, necessary, but not human. Not a person with thoughts or fears or a future of her own. "You'll give me grandsons," Margaret said. Not a question, a command. Anne curtsied, kept her face blank, went still inside. That night, Isabel came to her chamber. Isabel looked terrible, pale, thin, still recovering from the birth at sea, still grieving the baby. "You can't marry him," Isabel whispered. "Annie, he's dangerous. Mother won't say it, but everyone knows. Edward of Westminster is—" "I know," Anne said, her voice flat, empty. "I know what he is." "Then refuse. Tell father you won't." "And go where?" Anne looked at her sister. "We're exiles, Isabel. We have nothing. Father's estates in England are forfeit. We're living on Louis's charity. If I refuse, father has nothing to offer Margaret. The alliance fails. We stay in exile forever. Or worse, Louis throws us out and we starve." Isabel was crying. Anne wasn't. Anne had gone somewhere deep inside where tears couldn't reach. "I'll survive," Anne said. "I just have to survive." She had no idea what survival would cost. The wedding took place in Angers Cathedral on December 13th, 1470. Winter, cold stone, candles everywhere trying to push back the darkness. Anne wore cloth of gold, jewels borrowed from the French king, a crown of flowers that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Edward of Westminster stood beside her in crimson velvet, tall for 15, handsome in a sharp, cold way. He smiled during the ceremony. Anne didn't know if that was good or bad. Margaret of Anjou watched from the front row, her face hard, calculating, making sure this investment paid off. The ceremony was long, Latin prayers, blessings, the priest talking about duty and obedience and producing heirs. Anne's hand in Edward's hand. His palm was sweaty, or maybe hers was. She couldn't tell any more. They were married, husband and wife. Anne was 14 years old. The feast afterward was lavish. Louis XI paid for everything. Music, dancing, course after course of food. Anne couldn't eat. Her stomach was clenched tight, her throat closed. Edward of Westminster drank, laughed with his friends, talked about the invasion, about how they'd destroy Edward IV, about revenge, about blood. Anne sat beside him, silent, playing the role of dutiful wife, already learning that survival meant becoming invisible. When the feast ended, Anne was led to the bridal chamber by Margaret and a group of noble ladies. They undressed her, put her in a white shift, braided her hair, put her in the bed. All of this ritual, all of this ceremony around what was about to happen. Margaret leaned close. "Do your duty," she whispered. "Give him sons, or you're worthless." Then they left Anne alone in that chamber, waiting. Edward of Westminster came in drunk, stumbling. He looked at Anne in the bed and smiled. That same cold smile from the church. What happened next isn't recorded. History doesn't preserve wedding nights. Doesn't record what medieval girls endured when they were 14 and married to boys raised on violence. We just know Anne survived it. woke up the next morning, got dressed, played the role of princess, but something in her had broken, or maybe hardened. She stopped being a girl that night, became something else, something that could endure, could survive, could lock away whatever needed to be locked away. Anne and Edward didn't invade England immediately. Margaret didn't trust the situation, wanted to wait, make sure Warwick had truly won before risking her son. So Anne spent months in France, living in borrowed estates, playing the role of Princess of Wales, Edward's wife, Margaret's daughter-in-law. Edward largely ignored her. He had his friends, his plans, his violence. Anne was just the wife, the obligation, the thing that sealed his father-in-law's loyalty. But Margaret watched her, constantly, looking for signs of pregnancy, asking intrusive questions, making sure Anne understood her only value was her womb. "Have you bled this month?" Margaret would ask. No privacy, no shame, just cold evaluation. Anne learned to lie, to deflect, to keep parts of herself hidden even when everything else was exposed. She wrote letters to Isabel, careful letters that said nothing important because she knew they'd be read. But between the formal phrases, Isabel would understand, would know Anne was surviving, was enduring, was waiting. News came from England in September. Warwick had invaded, Edward IV had fled, Henry VI was restored to the throne. The Lancastrians had won. Margaret finally smiled. "We're going home," she told Anne. "You're going to be Queen of England, eventually, when your husband inherits." Anne said nothing, but inside she was screaming, because going to England meant being even more trapped, meant being in hostile territory, meant being tied forever to this family, this fate, this life she'd never chosen. They landed in England in April 1471, spring, the country green and blooming. Anne set foot on English soil for the first time in a year. The air smelled different from France, damper, heavier. Edward of Westminster walked beside her, playing the role of prince, waving to crowds, looking confident. Anne walked behind, where wives belonged, where women always walked. They travelled to London, slowly, with ceremony, stopping in towns where people came out to see the Prince of Wales and his bride. Some people cheered, Lancastrian supporters, people who hated Edward IV. Others just watched, silent, evaluating. Anne smiled when required, waved when required, said nothing. In London they stayed in royal apartments, the Tower. Not a prison yet, just a residence. Henry VI was there, restored to his throne. Anne met him once, briefly. He was broken, completely, barely coherent. He'd spent years imprisoned, years going mad, years being used as a figurehead by whoever held power. He looked at Anne with empty eyes, said something about God's will, wandered off. This was her father-in-law, the king her husband would inherit from, a madman who couldn't rule, couldn't govern, couldn't even dress himself some days. Anne realised the plan. Edward of Westminster wouldn't inherit. He'd rule, soon, maybe within months. Henry VI would be kept alive as a figurehead, while Edward and Margaret controlled everything. And Anne would be queen, to a violent boy king, controlled by his terrifying mother, with no power, no voice, no escape. She'd traded one prison for another. For 3 weeks, Anne played princess, attended court functions, sat beside Edward at dinners, wore silk and jewels, and smiled. She met Elizabeth Woodville's daughters, the girls left behind when their mother fled to sanctuary. They looked at Anne with hatred. Their father was in exile because of her father. Their brothers were disinherited because of her husband's claim. Anne was the enemy. She met Lancastrian nobles, men who'd fought for years, who'd lost everything, who were finally winning. They looked at her with calculation. Warwick's daughter, useful for now. But what happened when Warwick was no longer needed? Anne learned court politics fast, learned who to smile at, who to avoid, who was dangerous. She was 14 years old, and learning to navigate a royal court that wanted to use her. She wrote to her mother, asked how to survive. The Countess of Warwick wrote back with advice Anne already knew. Be obedient, be quiet, be useful, produce heirs, don't complain. Anne threw the letter in the fire. Then Edward IV invaded, landed in Yorkshire with an army, and Anne's temporary safety shattered. Edward of Westminster wanted to fight, begged his mother to let him join Warwick's army. Margaret refused. Too dangerous, too risky. Her son was too valuable. So they waited in London, while Warwick marched north to meet Edward IV, while the two armies met at Barnet in the fog, while Anne's father was killed and his body displayed naked in St. Paul's Cathedral like a traitor's corpse. Anne heard the news from a servant, just casual news, like weather. The Earl of Warwick is dead, my lady. Her father, dead. The man who'd shaped her entire life, who'd arranged her marriages, who'd used her as a tool, gone. Anne felt nothing, or everything. She couldn't tell. She just stood there while the servant waited for a reaction. Finally, she dismissed him, went to her chamber, sat on the bed, and still felt nothing. Maybe she'd gone too far inside, too deep into that place where feelings couldn't reach, or maybe she was just too exhausted to mourn. Her father had sold her, had married her to a monster, had put her in this position. Why should she cry? Isabel sent a message. I'm sorry. That's all it said. Anne didn't reply. Margaret decided to raise another army. In the west, Wales and the southwest, where Lancastrian support was strongest. Edward of Westminster would lead it, would prove himself, would win his throne through battle, and Anne would come with them, because wives followed husbands, because she was part of the propaganda. The Prince of Wales and his princess bride, united, strong. They marched west, Anne in a wagon, jostling over terrible roads, sleeping in strangers' houses, eating whatever local nobles provided, playing the role. Edward of Westminster talked constantly about the battle, about what he'd do to Edward IV's soldiers, about revenge, about blood, about victory. Anne said nothing, just watched, just waited. They never made it to Wales. Edward IV caught them at Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. On May 4th, 1471, the armies met in fields south of the town. Lancastrian forces exhausted from marching, Yorkist forces fresh and ready. Anne wasn't allowed near the battle, was kept in the town with Margaret and other noble women, waiting, listening to the sounds, metal on metal, screams, horses, death happening just beyond the walls. The battle lasted hours, then the sounds changed, became screams of retreat, panic. The Lancastrian army was breaking. Margaret started praying, loud, desperate, clutching rosary beads. Not my son, not my son, not my son. Men fled into the town, into Tewkesbury Abbey, seeking sanctuary, covered in blood, terrified, saying the Yorkists were slaughtering everyone, were giving no quarter. And then Yorkist soldiers were in the streets, in the abbey, dragging men out, killing them on consecrated ground, violating every law of sanctuary, every rule of holy ground. Anne pressed herself into a corner, made herself small, invisible, praying they wouldn't notice her, wouldn't recognize her. A soldier grabbed her arm. "Who are you?" Anne's mind went blank, couldn't think, couldn't speak. "She's no one," another woman said. "Just a servant." The soldier shoved Anne away, moved on, looking for nobles, for people worth ransoming or killing. Anne stayed in that corner for hours, while the killing continued, while Margaret screamed somewhere, while the town filled with blood and bodies and the smell of death. When it was finally quiet, Anne emerged, stepped over bodies, walked through blood, found Margaret being guarded by Yorkist soldiers. Margaret's face was destroyed, broken, empty. "Where's Edward?" Anne asked, her voice strange, distant. Margaret didn't answer, just stared at nothing. Anne found out later, Edward of Westminster was dead, killed in the battle or after. Accounts varied. Some said he died fighting, others said he was captured, brought before Edward IV and his brothers, questioned, and when he gave defiant answers, they killed him, stabbed him, multiple wounds. Richard of Gloucester was there, Anne's childhood friend, possibly delivered one of the blows, or maybe just watched. Sources disagree. Either way, Edward of Westminster was dead. Anne's husband, the violent boy she'd married in France, the prince who was supposed to be king, dead at 15. Anne was 14, a widow, her father dead, her husband dead, her father-in-law murdered in the Tower days later, the entire Lancastrian cause destroyed, and she was alive, standing in Tewkesbury covered in other people's blood, wondering what happened now. What happened now was George, Duke of Clarence, Isabel's husband, Anne's brother-in-law. He claimed custody of Anne, took her from Tewkesbury, brought her back to London, not out of family feeling, out of greed, because Anne was Warwick's daughter, and Warwick had been the wealthiest man in England. His estates had to go somewhere, half to Isabel through Clarence, half to Anne through whoever married Anne next. Clarence didn't want to share, wanted all of Warwick's wealth, all the estates, all the land, everything. So he hid Anne. This part sounds insane, like a fairy tale, but multiple sources confirm it. Clarence dressed Anne as a servant, placed her in a London household, somewhere no one would recognise her, kept her there, hidden, unable to contact anyone, unable to claim her inheritance. Anne was 15 years old, living disguised as a kitchen servant, scrubbing pots, sleeping in servants' quarters, pretending to be someone else, while her brother-in-law told everyone she'd disappeared, that no one knew where she was. But Richard of Gloucester was looking for her. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's youngest brother, the man who'd possibly killed Anne's first husband, the boy who'd been raised in Warwick's household, who'd known Anne since childhood, who'd played with her and Isabel when they were children. Before the wars, before everything, Richard wanted to marry Anne. Maybe because he remembered the girl she'd been. Maybe because he wanted half of Warwick's inheritance. Probably both. He searched London for her, quietly, carefully, asking servants, following rumours, until he found her. The sources say Richard rescued Anne from Clarence's household, took her to sanctuary at St. Martin's, protected her, then petitioned King Edward IV for permission to marry her. Edward approved. Maybe to keep both his brothers happy. Maybe because he thought it was fair. Maybe because he didn't care. Anne was given a choice. Technically, she could refuse, could stay in sanctuary, could try to claim her inheritance alone. But sanctuary was cold, unsafe, temporary, and Anne had no allies, no resources, no way to fight Clarence in court. She was 15, a widow, daughter of a traitor. She had no leverage. Richard was offering protection, status, a life. That was more than she had any right to expect. So Anne agreed. She married Richard, Duke of Gloucester, sometime in 1472. The exact date is unclear. It was a quiet wedding. No ceremony, no spectacle. Just a marriage, a transaction, a settlement that gave Richard half of Warwick's estates and gave Anne a husband. Anne was 15 or 16. Richard was 19. They'd known each other as children, played together at Warwick Castle, shared lessons. Now they were husband and wife. Did Anne love him? Did Richard love her? The sources don't say. Medieval marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances, property, heirs. Love was a bonus if it happened, not a requirement. What we know is that Richard took Anne north, to Middleham Castle in Yorkshire, the same castle where he'd been raised, where he'd trained as a knight, where he now served as Edward IV's Lord of the North. And Anne went with him, because she had no choice, because wives followed husbands, because survival meant accepting what you were given. But here's what's interesting. Anne had been to Middleham before. As a child, visiting with her father. She knew the castle, knew the layout, knew the cold stone and the draughty chambers and the northern wind that never stopped. She was going back to a place she'd known in childhood, before her father had sold her to a Lancastrian prince, before Tewkesbury, before the blood and death and loss. Maybe that felt like safety, or maybe it just felt like her life moving in circles, the same places, the same stones, different circumstances, but same fundamental truth. She was still a pawn, still being moved around by men, still powerless. Richard established them at Middleham, set up his household, his government, his northern court. Edward IV had given him control of the north as reward for loyalty. Richard took that responsibility seriously. He held courts, settled disputes, managed estates, built alliances with northern families, governed effectively, fairly by most accounts. People respected him, trusted him. The north became stable under Richard's rule. And Anne became Duchess of Gloucester, Richard's wife. Her role was to manage the household, supervise servants, host dinners for northern nobles, be decorative and supportive and useful. She'd done this before in France, played the role of princess. Now she played duchess, smiled at guests, made small talk, supervised the still room where medicines were made, checked household accounts, did embroidery, played music, all the things noble wives did. But she and Richard also had to deal with Clarence, who still wanted all of Warwick's inheritance, who refused to split it fairly, who claimed Anne had forfeited her rights by marrying a Lancastrian. The dispute went on for years, both brothers petitioning Edward IV, both sides refusing to compromise. It got vicious. Clarence claimed Anne was legally dead, that her marriage to Edward of Westminster had been treason, that she deserved nothing. Richard argued back. Anne had been a child, had no choice, had obeyed her father. It wasn't fair to punish her for that. Edward IV finally forced a settlement in 1474. The inheritance was split. Sort of. Richard and Anne got northern estates. Clarence and Isabel got southern estates, and more valuable titles. It wasn't fair. Anne should have inherited more, but it was done. Settled. Anne had spent years watching men fight over her dead father's property, fight over her value, measuring her worth in estates and manors and rents, while she had no voice in the process, no say in what was hers by right. But she got something else, something more important than estates. In late 1473, Anne became pregnant. Medieval pregnancy was terrifying. No prenatal care, no understanding of what could go wrong, no pain relief, no antibiotics for infections, just prayers and midwives and hope. Anne would have known the risks. Her sister Isabel had already lost 2 babies, one born at sea, dead within hours, another miscarried. Pregnancy killed women regularly. She was 16 years old and facing the possibility of death in childbirth. The pregnancy was hard. Anne was sick, constantly, vomiting, unable to eat, losing weight even as her belly swelled. Medieval medicine had no help for this, just suggestions to pray, to eat certain foods, to avoid stress. None of it worked. She spent months bedridden, servants bringing her food she couldn't keep down, Richard visiting when he could between governing duties, Anne alone with her body betraying her, but she survived. And in late 1473 or early 1474, Anne gave birth to a son, Edward, named after the king, after Richard's brother, after Anne's dead first husband, after everyone except the baby himself. The birth was agony. Medieval childbirth always was. No anesthesia, just pain, midwives holding her down, telling her to push, to breathe, to work. Blood everywhere. Anne screaming, her body tearing. Hours of this, maybe days. Time stopped meaning anything. And then crying, a baby crying. Anne's son, alive, healthy, a boy. Everything a medieval couple wanted. Continuation, legacy, security. They placed him in Anne's arms. tiny, wrinkled, perfect. Anne looked at her son and felt something break open inside her, something she'd kept locked away since Tewkesbury, since her father died, since her first husband was murdered. She loved him, immediately, completely. This tiny person who was hers, who she could protect, who she could keep safe, Edward of Middleham, her boy. Anne recovered slowly, her body damaged from the birth, infections, fever, pain, but she survived, and she had her son. That made everything worth it. Richard adored the baby, held him carefully, proudly, showed him to northern nobles. My son, my heir. Edward of Middleham represented Richard's future, his dynasty, his legacy, but to Anne, Edward was just her baby. The one thing in her life she'd chosen to love. The one thing that was truly hers. She nursed him herself. Unusual for noble women. They usually hired wet nurses, but Anne insisted, wanted those quiet moments, wanted to feel him close, wanted to believe she could keep him safe through proximity. Edward was a quiet baby. Didn't cry much. Just watched everything with solemn eyes. Anne talked to him constantly. Sang. Told him stories. Promised him things she couldn't guarantee. That he'd be safe. That he'd grow up strong. That nothing bad would happen to him. She couldn't keep those promises. For 10 years, Anne's life settled into something almost resembling peace. She and Richard lived at Middleham, raised Edward, governed the north, attended court occasionally when Edward IV summoned them to London. But mostly, they stayed north, away from dangerous politics, away from intrigue. Edward grew, learned to walk, to talk. He called Anne mother and Richard father, and seemed happy as medieval children could be. He had toys, carved wooden soldiers, a small horse he learned to ride, tutors who taught him Latin and French. But Edward was delicate, sickly. He caught colds easily, coughed through winters, had fevers that terrified Anne. She'd sit beside his bed, holding his small hand while he burned up, praying, bargaining with God, please not my son, please not my boy. Edward would recover, get better, smile at her with his small serious face. I'm well now, mother. And Anne would breathe again. She was fiercely protective, wouldn't let Edward out of her sight for long. Supervised his tutors, checked his food, made sure he was warm enough, safe enough, loved enough. Richard thought she coddled him. He needs to be strong, Richard said. He'll be a lord. He needs to hunt, to fight, to be... He's 6, Anne said, quiet but firm. He's my son, and he stays close. Richard let her win that argument, possibly because he saw the fear in her eyes, possibly because he understood Anne had lost too much already. Isabel died in 1476, Anne's sister, the only person who truly understood, who'd shared that childhood at Warwick Castle, who knew what it meant to be sold, to be used, to survive. Isabel was 25. She'd given birth to 4 children. Only 2 survived. Her body was wrecked from pregnancy after pregnancy. The last birth had gone wrong. Bleeding that wouldn't stop. Fever, infection, medieval medicine couldn't save her. Anne travelled south when she heard Isabel was dying, brought Edward with her, arrived too late. Isabel was already gone, already being prepared for burial. Anne stood in the chamber, looking at her sister's body, pale, waxen, empty, and felt that familiar numbness, that distance. Too many people dead, too much loss. She couldn't process it anymore. Clarence was there, already drunk, already planning how to keep Isabel's share of the inheritance, looking at Anne like she was his next problem. Anne took her son's hand and left, went back north, to Middleham, to safety. Edward asked questions about death, about where Aunt Isabel went, about heaven and God, and why people had to die. Anne had no good answers, just held him close. 2 years later, Clarence was executed, arrested for treason, for plotting against Edward IV, for spreading rumours, for being dangerous and unpredictable, and a problem no one wanted to deal with anymore. Edward IV condemned his own brother to death, had him executed privately, in the Tower of London. The story about drowning in wine was probably false, just regular execution, beheading or hanging. Quick, efficient, done. Anne felt nothing about Clarence's death. He'd hidden her, tried to steal her inheritance, been cruel to Isabel, let her die, worn out from childbirth. Anne was glad he was gone, but his death meant something important. Edward IV had no male heirs besides Clarence's young son, who was a child, untested. If Edward died, the succession was uncertain. Richard was next in line after Clarence. Richard, who was loyal, capable, experienced, trusted. But no, one expected Edward IV to die. He was 40, healthy, active. He had years left, except he didn't. Edward died suddenly in April 1483. Illness, maybe pneumonia, maybe stroke. His body just gave up after years of overindulgence. Too much food, too much wine, too much everything. He left behind 2 sons, Edward, Prince of Wales, 12 years old, Richard, Duke of York, 9 years old, both children. Too young to rule alone, and their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, wanted control, wanted her family governing during the Regency, wanted Richard of Gloucester pushed aside. Richard wasn't having it. He was the obvious choice for Lord Protector, the most experienced military commander, the only person who'd governed successfully for years. He marched south with an army, intercepted young Edward V, arrested the men with him, took custody of the young king, and sent word to Anne, "Come to London, bring Edward." Things were moving fast. Anne packed, terror in her chest. She'd been safe at Middleham for a decade, away from politics, away from danger. Now Richard was pulling her back into it. She held Edward's hand. "We're going to London to see your father." Edward looked at her with those solemn eyes. "Is it dangerous?" Anne couldn't lie. "Yes." "Then why are we going?" "Because your father needs us, and we don't abandon family." Edward nodded, small and serious and trusting. "I'll protect you, Mother." Anne's heart broke. He was 9 years old. What could he protect her from? They rode south, Anne and Edward and their household, taking weeks to travel, stopping at estates along the way. Anne feeling dread build with every mile. By the time they reached London in late May 1483, everything had changed. Richard had declared himself Lord Protector, taken control of the government. Young Edward V was in the Tower, officially for his protection, officially awaiting coronation. But Elizabeth Woodville had fled to sanctuary. Again. With her daughters and younger son, refusing to trust Richard, refusing to believe young Edward was safe. Anne moved into royal apartments, not the Tower, not where the young king was being held. Separate accommodations. She and Edward unpacked, settled in, waited. Richard came to see them. He looked exhausted, older, stressed. "It's chaos," he said. "The Woodvilles were planning to exclude me entirely. I had to act." Anne said nothing, just watched her husband, trying to understand what was happening. "The coronation is planned for June," Richard continued. "Edward will be crowned. I'll serve as regent until he's old enough. Everything will be fine." Anne didn't believe him. Something was wrong. She could feel it, could see it in Richard's eyes, in the way he couldn't quite meet her gaze. "Where's young Edward?" Anne asked. "The king. Can I see him?" "He's in the Tower, preparing, resting." "And his brother?" "Safe, with him." Anne wanted to ask more, wanted to demand answers, but she was a wife, a duchess. Women didn't demand. They waited, they obeyed. So Anne waited and watched, and felt the trap closing. In June, everything exploded. Parliament met, declared Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, declared that Edward had been pre-contracted to another woman, that his marriage to Elizabeth was bigamous, that all his children were illegitimate, bastards, which meant young Edward V wasn't legitimate, couldn't inherit, had no claim to the throne, and the next legitimate heir was Richard III. Parliament offered Richard the crown, and Richard hesitated, publicly, made a show of reluctance, said he didn't want the throne, but duty. but necessity, but the good of the kingdom. Anne watched this performance from the sidelines, watched her husband be offered a crown, watched him accept it, watched him become king, and realized what that made her. Queen. Again. She was 27 years old. She'd been a princess once, a Lancastrian fantasy that ended in blood. Now she was queen for real. Richard's queen. King Richard III and Queen Anne. Did she want this? Did she understand what it meant? She understood. She'd lived through enough politics to know exactly what becoming queen meant. Target, scrutiny, danger, no safety, no peace, just survival at the highest possible stakes. Richard was crowned on July 6, 1483, Westminster Abbey, all the ceremony medieval England could provide. Robes of state, holy oil, blessings, the crown placed on Richard's head. And beside him, Anne, also crowned, also blessed, also transformed from duchess to queen. She wore cloth of gold, ermine trim, jewels that belonged to queens of England going back generations. She processed through London while crowds watched. Some cheered, some stood silent, some whispered. Edward of Middleham, now 9 or 10 years old, was created Prince of Wales, heir to the throne. Everything Anne's first husband had been, everything he'd died trying to claim. Anne watched her son receive his title, watched him kneel before his father, watched the crown of the Prince of Wales placed on his small head, and felt terror, because princes of Wales died. Edward of Westminster had been Prince of Wales, died at Tewkesbury, stabbed, murdered, his body displayed, and the 2 other princes, young Edward V and his brother Richard, were still in the Tower, still officially alive, still officially awaiting something. What happened to those boys is one of history's great mysteries. Sometime in summer 1483, they disappeared from public view. No more sightings, no more accounts, just silence. Did Richard III have them killed? Probably. Most historians agree. The boys were a threat. Their very existence challenged Richard's claim. As long as they lived, rebellion was possible. People could rally to them, use them as figureheads. So they disappeared, likely smothered, buried somewhere in the Tower. Bodies, hidden, evidence destroyed. Did Anne know? Was she told? Did she ask what happened to those boys? One had been king for 2 months. One had been 9 years old, just a year younger than her own son. We'll never know. Anne's knowledge, her complicity, her feelings, all lost. History doesn't record what queens knew about murdered princes. Doesn't record if they cared, if they protested, if they were relieved it was done. All we know is the princes vanished, and Anne's son became heir, and the throne seemed secure, except it wasn't. Anne's reign as Queen of England lasted 18 months, just over a year, and it was marked by constant fear, constant rebellion, constant awareness that Richard's claim was contested. In October 1483, a major rebellion erupted, led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, a man who'd helped Richard take the throne, who'd supported his claim, who'd stood beside him during the coronation, and who now turned against him, rebelled, tried to overthrow Richard and put Henry Tudor on the throne. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian exile living in France, a man with a weak claim, descended from an illegitimate line. But he made a promise if he became king, he'd marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, unite the 2 houses, end the wars. It was brilliant propaganda, and it worked. People were tired of civil war, tired of death, tired of kings killing nephews and brothers, betraying brothers. Henry Tudor offered peace, stability, an end. The rebellion was crushed, Buckingham was captured, executed, his head stuck on a pike, but the threat didn't end. Henry Tudor was still in France, still building support, still planning invasion. Richard knew it was coming, knew he'd have to fight, knew his throne would never be secure as long as Henry lived. Anne watched her husband prepare for war, watched him fortify castles, raise armies, build alliances, watched him harden, become more suspicious, more paranoid, trust fewer people. She performed her duties as queen. Public appearances, ceremonies, Christmas celebrations at Westminster, Easter at court, sitting beside Richard in state, smiling, waving, playing the role. But privately, Anne was terrified. For Richard, for Edward, for herself, because if Henry Tudor invaded and won, they were all dead. Richard would be executed, Anne would be imprisoned or worse. And Edward, what would happen to her son? She couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't sleep, lost weight, became pale, worn. People at court whispered, said the Queen looked ill, said she was fading. Anne ignored them, focused on Edward. Her son was at Middleham, safe, away from London, away from court politics. She visited when she could, held him, checked that he was eating, sleeping, warm. Edward was growing, taller, his voice changing, becoming a young man. But he was still fragile, still caught colds easily, still coughed through winters. "I'm going to be king someday," Edward said, quiet, serious. "Like father." Anne smoothed his hair. "Not for a long time. Your father will rule for years. But someday. And I'll need to be ready. To be strong. To protect England." Anne's throat closed. Her son. Her gentle, serious boy. Talking about kingship, about duty, about responsibility. "You'll be a good king," Anne said. "Better than most." She didn't know he'd never get the chance. In April 1484, Anne was at Middleham with Edward. Richard was in the south handling administrative matters. Anne spent her days with her son, walking the castle grounds, sitting with him during lessons, just being close. Edward seemed quieter than usual, tired. He wasn't eating well. Said his stomach hurt. Said he felt cold even by the fire. Anne sent for physicians. They examined him, prescribed useless remedies, bloodletting, herbal drinks, prayers. Medieval medicine was guesswork and hope. Edward got worse. Fever, coughing, pain. He stayed in bed. Anne sat beside him, held his hand, sang the song she'd sung when he was a baby. "Mother," Edward whispered, "I'm sorry." "For what, darling?" "For being sick, for not being strong." Anne's heart shattered. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. You're perfect. You're my perfect boy." Edward smiled. Small, weak, then closed his eyes. He died on April 9th, 1484, 10 or 11 years old. Cause unknown. Maybe tuberculosis, maybe some other illness. Medieval records just say he died, at Middleham, in his mother's arms. Anne felt something break inside her, something fundamental, something that held her together. It snapped, shattered, dissolved. Her son was gone. Her boy, the one good thing she'd had, the one thing she'd loved without reservation, dead. She held his body, refused to let go. Servants tried to take him, to prepare him for burial. Anne screamed at them, held Edward closer, wouldn't release him. Richard arrived days later, having ridden hard from the south. He found Anne still sitting with Edward's body. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't move. Richard gently took Edward from her arms. "Anne, love, he's gone. You have to let him go." Anne looked at her husband with empty eyes. "I have nothing left," she whispered. "Nothing." They buried Edward of Middleham at Sheriff Hutton Church, a small chapel, a simple tomb, the Prince of Wales, heir to England, dead at 10. Anne stood at the graveside, dry-eyed, hollow. She'd cried all her tears, had nothing left, just emptiness, just the understanding that everything she loved died, everyone she loved was taken from her. Richard tried to comfort her. "We'll have another son. We're young enough. We can—" "No." Anne's voice was flat, final. "No more children, no more loss. I can't. I won't." Richard didn't argue. Maybe he saw the brokenness in her. Maybe he understood that Anne was done. Done with duty. Done with trying. Done with everything. Anne withdrew. into herself, into her chambers, into the numbness that felt better than feeling. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped being present. She was dying, slowly, of grief, of exhaustion, of having endured too much for too long. Her body was giving up, surrendering, letting go. By winter 1485, Anne was bedridden, wasting away, thin, pale, coughing blood, maybe tuberculosis, maybe cancer, maybe just the accumulated weight of loss crushing her from inside. Physicians attended her, prescribed useless treatments, bloodletting, purgatives, prayers. Nothing worked. Anne just kept fading, getting weaker, getting lighter, disappearing. Richard visited when he could, sat with her, held her hand, talked about court business like she cared, like she was still present. But Anne was somewhere else, somewhere deep inside where loss couldn't reach anymore. "Anne," Richard said one day, "stay with me, please, I need you." Anne looked at him. This man she'd married, this husband who'd been kind enough, who'd given her a son, who'd made her queen, and she felt nothing. No love, no resentment, no connection, just emptiness. "I'm already gone," she whispered. By March 1485, Anne could barely breathe. Every breath hurt. Her lungs were failing, her body shutting down. She was 28 years old and dying. On March 16th, there was a solar eclipse. The sky went dark at midday. People panicked, screamed about omens, about God's judgment, about the end of the world. Anne died that day, while the sky was black, while people outside wept and prayed, while Richard was somewhere else dealing with state business, unable to be with his wife when she finally stopped breathing. She died alone, in pain, glad it was over, glad to stop fighting, glad to join her son, her father, her sister, everyone who'd already gone. Anne was 28 years old. She'd been married twice, widowed once, crowned queen, buried her only child, and endured more loss than most people experienced in twice the time. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, beside Edward IV, beside other royalty, a queen's burial, all the ceremony, all the ritual, all the pretense that she'd mattered. Richard mourned publicly, wore black, played the grieving widower, made the right sounds, did the right things. And then immediately rumours started that Richard had poisoned Anne, that he'd wanted her dead so he could remarry, that he'd planned to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, that Anne had been in the way. The rumours were probably false, probably propaganda from Richard's enemies, but they spread, grew, became accepted truth. Anne couldn't even die without being used, without her death becoming political ammunition. Richard denied the rumours, publicly swore he'd loved Anne, that she'd died of natural illness, that he'd never planned to marry Elizabeth. Whether he was telling the truth, we'll never know. 5 months after Anne died, Henry Tudor invaded England, landed in Wales in August 1485, marched east, gathered supporters. Richard met him at Bosworth Field on August 22nd. Richard had the larger army, had everything to fight for, but his allies betrayed him, switched sides, left him exposed. Richard charged, personally, trying to reach Henry Tudor, trying to end this with single combat. He was surrounded, dragged from his horse, killed in the mud. His crown fell off, rolled away, was picked up and placed on Henry Tudor's head. King Richard III was dead. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. The Wars of the Roses were over. Henry married Elizabeth of York, united the houses, started the Tudor dynasty. And Anne? Anne was already buried, already forgotten, already erased from the narrative. The Tudors rewrote history, made Richard the villain, the child killer, the usurper, made Henry the saviour, the unifier. And Anne became a footnote, Richard's wife, Warwick's daughter, mother of a prince who died young, queen for 18 months, dead at 28. They didn't remember that she'd been married at 14 to a violent prince. that she'd watched her first husband murdered, that she'd lost her father in battle, that she'd been hidden and used and treated like property, that she'd buried her only child, that she'd died young and broken. They just remembered she'd existed, then moved on. Anne Neville's life was 28 years of loss, of being powerless, of watching men decide her fate while she endured. She was born into privilege, raised with every advantage, and still couldn't control anything, still couldn't protect herself, still couldn't save her son. She was married at 14, widowed at 15, remarried at 16, became queen at 27, buried her son at 28, died at 28, less than 3 decades, most of them marked by grief, by fear, by being moved around like a chess piece, while men played games with kingdoms. Anne deserved better, deserved a life where she had choices, where she could say no, where she could protect the people she loved. But she lived in medieval England during the Wars of the Roses, and in that time, in that place, women didn't get choices. They got marriages, they got commands, they got used, and Anne was used well. At least she became queen. At least she had a son for 10 years. At least her second marriage probably wasn't actively miserable. But that's not good enough. That's not justice. That's just slightly less terrible than it could have been. Anne Neville was a girl who became a pawn at 14 and never stopped being one, even when she wore a crown, even when they called her queen. She was still someone else's tool, someone else's strategy, someone else's sacrifice. She survived as long as she could, endured as much as she could, loved her son with everything she had, and when he died she had nothing left to fight for. So she stopped, let go, died. 28 years. That's all Anne Neville got. And then she was gone, buried, forgotten, her story erased by Tudor propaganda and the passage of time. But tonight we remembered her, told her story, acknowledged her suffering, made sure someone knows that Anne Neville existed, that she mattered, that her life, short and tragic as it was, deserves to be remembered. Rest well, Anne Neville. You endured enough. Thanks for staying with me tonight. If you made it this far, drop a comment and let me know what you think. What surprised you most about Anne's story? Had you heard of her before? Let's talk about it. Sleep well? Or don't? Sometimes the truth is worth staying awake for.